welcome to the session 4, and it is stream signification process and culture. So we will start with Yvan Prkachin.
Close enough.
And whose speech will be on a very hot topic today, because we'll talk about natural intelligence to artificial intelligence, which is a quite discussed problem today. Many, such as, for example, Luciano Floridi, which is maybe the most known philosopher dealing with information technology, claims that artificial intelligence is just artificial stupidity without saying anything about his claim. So it is very important to understand why McCarthy used the term artificial intelligence and the development of this discipline, as Yvan will explain us.
Sure. You guys hear me okay? Check. All right. I may stand up at some point because I lecture a lot. I'm never quite sure. You get the idea. I'm not actually, in a way, a historian of information technology. I kind of masquerade as a historian of technology. I mostly do the history of the brain sciences and mind sciences and things like that. This is mostly just a story I stumbled into while working on my book manuscript. So all thoughts and corrections are welcome. So in the wake of World War II, a series of major new sciences emerged that would sort of heavily shift the conceptual categories and practices of the human sciences more broadly in the subsequent decades, most notably information theory and cybernetics, which is usually thought to include the emergence of neural networking research in the 1940s. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap between these categories, but you get the idea. All of them have their respective paternal figures, and there's been some really good books written about all the kind of big key players like Norbert Wiener, Claude Shannon, and this guy, Warren McCulloch, who is typically taken to be kind of the father of neural networking. Neural networking, by the way, is about half of what contemporary AI research is all about. You have convolutional neural networks and deep learning and so forth. And the origin story for them is pretty straightforward, largely linked to wartime computing and early cybernetics. So in 1943, Warren McCulloch and this mathematical genius that he worked with named Walter Pitts published a paper in which they argue that because of the all or none action of the neuron, and because it's known that neurons in the cortex have multisynaptic connections, it's possible, it's at least possible, that neurons function like logic gates. And that because they might do this, they might actually embody logical operations like the ones that you see in Boolean logic. So they can do and, or, if, then, not, else, things like that. Now, by their own admission, and McCulloch knew enough neurophysiology to know that this is probably not how neurons actually work. But it was a very interesting idea, and it was very generative. And it's a hugely influential paper, and so we're sort of off to the races with neural networking. And yet, if you pick up any modern textbook on neural networking or cognitive science or artificial intelligence or psychology, and you start reading on the history of neural networks, you'll almost always see another figure who comes up. A good representative example you find in things like Rumelhart and McClellan's PDP research group textbook. They are key players in the neural networking explosion in the 1980s. And they always note, say things like this. While it was McCulloch and Pitts that suggested how neurons could compute, there was this other character, this guy named Donald Hebb, who showed how they could learn. And again, if you go through oral histories of this period, textbooks, papers, you'll see this name coming up, Hebb, over and over and over again. And unlike McCulloch and Pitts, there's actually very little written about him, and he had no interest in cybernetics whatsoever. This is all the more surprising given how his students speak about him. Admirers have spoken of Hebb in rhapsodic terms, asserting that his work would one day be ranked alongside Darwin's for its kind of explanatory power and conceptual elegance. Hebb exercised a really pervasive influence on the brain and mind sciences in the second half of the 20th century. And just as a simple metric, if you do a Google Scholar search for how many citations his famous masterwork, The Organization of Behavior, The Organization of Behavior had, it's been cited 39,000 times, which is more than virtually any other comparable book. It's more than Chomsky, it's more than Skinner, it's more than Hull. It's just this hugely influential book. You get lists of who are the most influential psychologists of the 20th century. His name will often be ranked above Pavlov and George Miller and Harry Harlow and Jerry Bruner, all the big names. So who was this guy? We don't know so much about him. In order to answer that question and to explain why this is also important for neural networking, we have to understand just what Hebb was doing in a very concrete way. We also need to understand the kind of interdisciplinary trading zones that he and some key students occupied in the mid-20th century, when the boundaries between the human sciences and the engineering sciences were actually much more porous than we typically realize. So who was this guy? Learning, to a certain extent, was in Hebb's blood. He started out his career as an elementary school teacher in Quebec in the 1930s. He actually ran an experiment to see if he could get his students to learn faster and more efficiently, and he published this. It's an interesting story in and of itself. By the 1930s, Hebb was studying with the neuropsychologist Carl Lashley at Chicago and Harvard, working on Lashley's program of research, which involved training rats in mazes, and then you ablate away part of the rat brain to see if you can figure out what behaviors have been altered. And ultimately, what Lashley was looking for was what he called the site of the engram, the physical location of memory, which, if you're interested, by the way, actually has a lot to do with his racial politics, but that's another story. By 1937, Hebb had been recruited to work at a place called the Montreal Neurological Institute, where the pioneering brain surgeon Wilder Penfield was perfecting his surgical treatment for epilepsy, which frequently involved fairly aggressive removal of brain tissue that was believed to be scarred or epileptogenic in some way. Chunk of brain causes the epilepsy, let's go in, cut it out. That was basically the idea. And it's quite unusual. This is an image of the Penfield operating room. There's Penfield doing what's called a cortical resectioning. And there's Hebb talking to the patient while the resectioning is happening. He's conscious during all of this, and he can report what he's experiencing. It's amazing that I could go on about this at some length. It's quite interesting. And this was very unusual at the time. Psychologists did not work in brain surgery clinics. They certainly didn't work in the operating room. So this was very novel practice. In 1937, Penfield operated on a young man, we know his name, I know his name because I've read his patient files, named Ken Matthews, who had been injured in a logging camp when he was about 15 and had subsequently developed very bad epilepsy. During the operation, Penfield removed most of the patient's frontal lobes. So about a sixth of his brain comes out. And because he had a psychologist working with him, Penfield had an idea, which is, why don't we run IQ tests before and after the operation to see what happens? Sounds like kind of an obvious thing to do. This is the first time anyone ever thought to do it. So they run the IQ test, they do the operation, they ablate about a sixth of his frontal lobes. Any guesses what happened? Anyone care to guess? Yeah? His IQ went up about 11 points, which is weird. I think that's the technical term. And by the way, this was not a one-off thing. They checked this, rechecked it, checked for practice effect, checked for every conceivable problem. This was a clean IQ signal. They were very, very careful about this. By the way, this is actually still a somewhat well-observed phenomenon in epilepsy patients. You do an IQ test before and after, it'll go up for reasons I can explain. Hebb and Penfield came to slightly different conclusions about what was going on here. Penfield argued for the existence of something he called the nociferous cortex. Basically, the argument was damaged brain tissue also suppresses the functions of the healthy surrounding tissue. So take out the bad stuff, the good stuff will start to work better. It's an interesting theory, might be something to it. Hebb became obsessed with this case, and I know this because I've read virtually everything the man's ever written privately. He couldn't get it out of his mind, and he spent the next 10 years trying to figure out what the heck was going on here. The frontal lobe, part of his conclusion was that the frontal lobes were responsible for learning new knowledge, but not necessarily retaining existing knowledge. The frontal lobes, long thought to be the seat of intelligence, the lobes of civilization, were superfluous to normal behavior. This was his conclusion. To explain that state of affairs, Hebb completely reorients his career and develops an explanation of how this could be. The intellectual history of his sort of theories are quite interesting, but I can tell you more if you want to know. And it's entirely based on trying to figure out what was going on in this case. He eventually develops a whole new theory of brain function, the capstone of which is a physiological postulate for learning, what he called his physiological postulate. And it's expressed like this: when an axon of cell A is near enough to excite a cell B and repeatedly or persistently takes place in firing it, some growth process or metabolic change takes place in one or both cells such that A's efficiency as one of the cells firing B is increased. That's kind of dry language, but if you've ever picked up a modern psychology textbook, you will see this law often in its colloquial form. Neurons that fire together wire together. You hear this, again, take any psych class, they'll tell you this. He's the guy who came up with it. That's where the idea came from. Now, anyone who knows their history of psychology and neurology knows that this is in many ways something akin to classical associationist psychology combined with a kind of Pavlovian conditioning taken down to the level of brain cell activity. It's a little bit more complex than that. I can tell you some of the details, but that's basically what the theory is all about. I could go on at some length about what this book and this theory did for American psychology. Turns out, if you trace the connections, it's hugely influential in all sorts of interesting areas, from theories about pain and pleasure to the race and IQ debate. It's everywhere. So how did this theory end up being so crucial for early artificial intelligence work, especially given, as far as I can tell, Hebb never touched a computer in his entire life? In order to understand that, I have to introduce a new character. This guy named Nathanial Rochester, who was an IBM engineer in 1954. We actually don't know much about him, even though it turns out he looks like he was a pretty important guy. He was a kind of engineering savant who worked in MIT's Rad Lab, and he goes to IBM, and he's actually the lead engineer on something called the IBM 701, which is the first commercially available computer in the United States. It's the first one you can just sort of order off the shelf. In 1954, he contacts Hebb and he says, I read your book. I'm very interested in this. We're trying to simulate the actions of neurons on one of our very large calculators, he calls it. And as he put it, the idea made good engineering sense to him. It sort of was parsable in the engineering sciences dialect that he understood. But he'd run into a problem, which is that the program kept crashing. Technical language, but basically crashing. So he writes Hebb and says, do you have any insight? Do you have any sense of why this would be? Hebb's not really interested, but he says, I have this graduate student. Maybe you should talk to him. I have introduced a third character, this guy named Peter Milner. What expertise did he have? Well, Peter Milner's wife is a woman named Brenda Milner, who is a psychologist who eventually would become very well known to the rest of the world. By the way, still alive as of today at the age of 104. I can tell you some very interesting stories about her. She had introduced Peter to psychology. His day job is that he was an electrical engineer on a nuclear plant at Chalk River near Montreal. That was what this guy did. He read the book. His wife said, you got to read this book. He read it. He says, I'm done with nuclear physics. I want to be a psychologist. By the way, like I said, if you recognize Brenda Milner's name, it's because she's the one who did the pioneering research with the amnesic patient, HM. Remember her name. If I have time, I'll tell you a fun coda to this story that involves her, but we'll come back to that. What Peter Milner does, the technical details are a little complicated, but essentially what he suggests is that Hebb's neural model has to be updated to take into account the idea of inhibition. Inhibition is not in the original Hebb theory. Inhibition, I'm sure most of you know, one neuron stops the firing of other neurons. This had just been demonstrated by John Eccles in the spinal nerves in Australia, not just the spinal nerves that are in Australia, but he had done this in Australia. And Milner says, well, you got to try this. Also, if you don't do this, the system you have right now is admirably suited to produce uncontrolled epileptic discharge, and it's somewhat like a nuclear fission reactor. So what he was saying is that Rochester's program was acting like an epileptic patient. The neurons kept firing and firing and firing, and there was no inhibition or control rod to slow the firing down. So he's basically saying you've built an artificial brain that's kind of like an uncontrolled nuclear reactor or an uncontrolled epileptic. You need to stop the constant firing. They update the model. By the way, this was not just hypothetical. The Chalk River reactor that he worked on had almost melted down a few times at this point, so he had some stake in this problem. They update the cellular model, and it works. It works basically on the first try. I know it's a little hard to tell from the output, but those are Hebbian cell assemblies starting to be formed by this neural model in 1954, being spit out on punch cards. So this is really exciting stuff. It seems to be working very, very well. So what happened to these people? Why don't we know about this story? Well, Rochester took his paper to this thing called the Dartmouth Conference for Artificial Intelligence in 1955. This is sometimes thought of as the birthplace of modern AI research. And he runs into a problem, which is that his sort of I should say, by the way, this is what he thought he was up to. He thought he was making a machine that could embody concepts. That's why he called the prototype a conceptor. At the Dartmouth Conference, it's sometimes thought of as the birthplace of AI. It's less frequently remembered as the place where neural networks died. It turns out when he went to give this talk, went to present these papers, everyone who else was interested in AI was absolutely hostile to neural networking. Most notably, these two guys, Marvin Minsky, who's at MIT, and JCR Licklider, one of my favorite names, who played an enormously influential role in early computing, mainly because he controlled military funding. And between Minsky and Licklider, they basically said, we're not interested in neural networks. Minsky had written a PhD thesis that he thought proved that neural networks don't work based on his experience doing them. He said, I can't build them, so nobody can build them. He's a man with a bit of an ego. And that was that. Money was funneled away from neural networking research, despite how sort of promising this initial Rochester program had been. Minsky eventually came up with a sort of formal reason for why he thought that these things couldn't work, which he later published with his colleague Simon Paper. He basically said, look, neural networks have a fatal flaw. Something called, anybody ever done any neural computing? It's something called the exclusive OR problem, which basically means neural networks are meant to do categorizing. The problem is there's no way to weight a single set of neural connections to categorize something as one thing or the other, but not both. That's mathematically impossible. So neural networks were gone, but not forgotten. This coincides with what's sometimes called the first AI winter. Turns out Minsky's symbolic processing approach didn't work very well either. All of artificial intelligence research sort of falls into disrepute for a couple of decades. But there were some people who kept noodling away at this problem, one of the most important being a guy named Paul Werbosch. I don't think anyone else has noticed this. Paul Werbosch wrote to Don Hebb in 1964 and said, I've been thinking about this neural networking issue, and I think the problem is this, and he outlines what the problem is. Hebb writes back and says, I'm not really interested, but I had this graduate student, he wrote a paper 20 years ago that explains this whole issue, why don't you read it? And it's right after that that Werbosch actually cracks the exclusive OR problem. He realizes you can't build inhibition into a computerized neural model, but what you can do is if you include multiple layers of neurons and you have the classifier feed the errors back into the system, it kind of sort of works like inhibition. It's a technique called error backpropagation. And that's why it's called deep learning, because it has multiple layers of neurons. Deepness has no reference to like the deepness of thought. That's all it kind of refers to. Now I want to conclude, I should say, by the way, once this exclusive OR problem was cracked, that's when neural networking exploded as a field of research in the 1980s. It was largely through a recovery of this strange early collaboration between brain surgeons, psychologists, and electrical engineers that the entire field of neural networking started to work again. So I wanted to conclude just by saying a few things quickly. First, what I've just told you is, I hope, not just a simple story about priority, who came up with what first. That's an old theme in the history of technology and not without its value. Rather, though, I think in exploring the origins of neural networks, we can gain a deeper appreciation for both the historical circumstances of their development, the kind of very porous trading zone between the human sciences and the engineering sciences, and the ways that traversing these different scientific disciplines and trading zones actually transformed the concept of intelligence. For Hebb, intelligence was learning. For Rochester, intelligence was an engineering problem. And part of that disaggregation, or that transition in the concept of intelligence from faculty to engineering problem, is one of the things that kicks off the disaggregation of the concept of intelligence from the reified sort of IQ of the first half of the 20th century into not so much a series of separate faculties as a series of engineering problems to be solved, which, for my money, is one of the most interesting transformations in psychology in the last 100 years or so. And I think the story of Hebb, Rochester, and the origins of deep learning not only tells us something about efforts at AI in our own time, but about the potential fruitful collaboration between historians of technology and of the human sciences. I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done there. And since I have just a few seconds left, and I'll stop, you might have been wondering what happened to KM, that patient. Oh, sorry. There we go. You might have been wondering what happened to KM, that patient, Ken Matthews. After he left the Institute, he actually enlisted in World War II and fought successfully. They asked him, "How did you get that scar on your head?" And he said, "Oh, I had a brain operation." They didn't seem to have a problem with him enlisting. He served in England for a while, then he relapsed, had a fairly catastrophic seizure, moved back home, actually had no difficulty at all finding a job. There was a very good labor market after World War II, and he just kind of traded up and did pretty well for himself, actually. But there is a funny irony to this entire story. You remember Brenda Milner, the psychologist I told you about? In 1964, she tracked KM down and retested him. She ran all of the original IQ tests again and got exactly the same results, by the way. As she put it, ran Hebb's tests, the literal tests, absolutely confirmed everything he got. But in the subsequent decades, she'd been developing new tests for frontal lobe function. She had worked with all these patients very carefully. And when she ran the tests for what's called perseverative behavior, she said, "I found exactly what I had learned to see in prefrontal cortex cases, which is this classic frontal lobe sign." And so I think it's kind of touching in a way that in the final analysis, KM and his frontal lobes were important after all. So that's it. Thank you. You want to do questions now?
I will start.
Sure, go for it.
I will warm up.
Go for it.
Another direct example of strange things that happen after untouched brain is that of James Brady.
Right.
Who is James Brady? James Brady was the President Reagan bodyguard during the shooting of the
When he
Reagan
got shot,
shot, the assault to Donald Reagan. And one of the bullets entered into his eye and damaged the brain. Now everybody thought he was going to die but after a surgery which exported the part of the brain, he still survived for more 33 years. Of course, he was in a wheelchair, he was not able to recognize many people, but the doctor said that he was quite able to reasoning and keep distance from emotions. Do you know how much brain he was left? A quarter. So I think that using these two examples, I guess we don't know still much about the brain functioning.
Depends on who you ask. Brenda Milner, who I've actually spoken with a couple of times, that's a funny story. I can perhaps better over a drink, but she spent her entire career at the Neurological Institute, about 50 years. She retired, by the way, when she was 97. And she's literally worked with thousands of patients who've either had brain surgery or serious brain injuries. And she's got it down to, she can tell you virtually what this patient is going to do before they do it. I mean, this is through slow, careful, accumulative work. What she'd also be the first person to say is, if you try to ascribe a very specific psychological function to a very specific brain injury, best of luck. I mean, there's so much complexity. What you have to do is extremely careful, methodical testing. She tells a funny story about how she used to have to squeeze her testing in between the X-ray and what was called the pneumogram procedure for these brain surgery patients. Now she has a whole department to herself, and they schedule the surgeries around her testing. So that's how she gets all this great material. But the point is well taken, which is that particularly in this period, the frontal lobes were incredibly mysterious, and this is the language the surgeons used. Partially because Penfield, he would map cortex with an electrical probe. He wanted to know what he was going to. You want to know what you're cutting out. The problem is the frontal lobes don't respond when you zap them with electricity. They don't produce any obvious effect. For a while, this was taken to mean, well, either all of the intellect is there or it doesn't do anything. So I mean, he'd probably be the first person to say he was being a little bit radical in some of these operations. But at the time, it seemed like a not unreasonable strategy. So I thought that's an answer to your question. Maybe, are there thoughts, concerns, anxieties? Yeah.
I always thought it was interesting with Penfield how so much information that we have about the human brain is conducted on patients with epilepsy.
Yeah.
Or some sort of like pathological thing. And I think what you brought up about Rochester trying to take that information and replicate it mechanically turns into a pathological machine.
Right.
So is there a certain point, because I'm kind of like only familiar up until the point of Penfield when they discovered that inhibitor inhibition. Is there a time at which they're able to study not pathological brains, or is all of the experimentation or all of the research done on patients?
In this time period, almost exclusively on patients with tumors or epilepsy or some other brain trauma, because there's no imaging. You have EEG, but it's still very primitive. Actually, the best EEG guy in the world worked at the Neurological Institute, and him and Penfield were like the John and Paul of brain science in that period. They were just beautiful melodies together, but they were still figuring this technology out, and there was a lot of false starts. What makes epilepsy really interesting in this context is that if you have a brain tumor, the brain tumor grows and it compresses and can kill off certain brain tissue. That makes correlating cognitive function with brain tissue damage very difficult, because you don't know, was it compressed, was it losing blood, it's really messy. Epilepsy is great. I mean, it's horrible, but it's great for the scientists because the tissue doesn't compress. So you kind of know exactly what you're taking out. That's why Hebb and Penfield referred to this case as close as you can get to an extirpation experiment, what you would do with rats, where you just slice out exactly what you want. There's no surrounding damage, so it becomes very, very precise. Also, I'll go on, stop in a sec, but through the electrical mapping, you get a much more robust understanding of cognitive function. So Brenda Milner is the one who eventually figures out through work with HM, which is also an epilepsy operation, the pivotal role played by the hippocampus in memory consolidation. Nothing like this was possible before you could do what Penfield called radical treatment for epilepsy. Well, I can tell you more about that if you're interested. Other questions, thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question because it's now completely about brain damage and also in a very localized manner. It's about localization theory.
Right.
And I was wondering, did they, because they have this firing together, wiring together
right.
theories as well, did they look at some sort of like developmental issues, especially thinking about frontal lobe nuclear connections?
So Hebb's theory is actually rooted, I told you the intellectual history is a little complicated. Part of what he builds his theory of cellular learning out of is comparisons between brain surgery patients and children who have had brain damage early in life. And he's fairly convinced, based on the limited data he looks at, that kids who suffer brain damage early in life don't display quite the same cognitive problems that somebody who gets clunked on the head in their 30s does. The fact that KM was 15 when this happens messes with the data a little bit.
But it's constantly like physical damage.
Yeah.
For example, the Romanian.
Oh, I see where you're going. Yeah. Right. So the possibility of kind of pathological brain use over time that turns into.
They've done that. The Romanian orphanages.
Right. It's not the kind of thing that Penfield would have considered amenable to surgical treatment, although he did try lobotomies very, very briefly, which is a remarkable story I can also tell you about. And he gave up on it. He said, this is a waste of time. It doesn't do it. I need to see a lesion or I can't operate.
And I also didn't consider it at all because
right.
you were talking about how these fields come together. So I was wondering, why is this part of thinking about how the development goes wrong and connections
right.
are not built?
Right.
Why?
The other reason was because Penfield hated psychiatrists. And it didn't help that the psychiatrist he hired ended up working for the CIA's MK Ultra mind control program, which is that's a crazy story, but we can talk about that later. I should stop. You have other talks. We got one more?
One minute.
Go for it.
Last question,
I'll be so deep.
Do you know what the series Westworld? It's an HBO show.
What is it called? Oh, Westworld. Yeah.
Yes. Is it a good example on Hebb's theory?
Not so much Hebb's, but fun fact, the big theory of consciousness in that show makes reference to a guy named Julian Jaynes. Has anybody ever heard of Julian Jaynes? Some historians of psychology know. He had this theory, the book has a horrible title, but it's called The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. The idea being, it's a crazy theory, but it's interesting. It's worth noting, by the way, that he developed that theory after the left brain, right brain, corpus callosum sectioning epilepsy surgeries of the 1940s and 50s and 60s, which are based on Penfield's procedures, by the way. That's when you get people saying, oh, the left brain and right brain have two types of consciousness and they have to be integrated and blah, 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 blah. So as it turns out, epilepsy surgery is like where most modern theories of consciousness developed, but I can tell you more about that if you're curious.
Just a quick fun fact about Julian Jaynes is that it's not here this year, but Bill Woodward, who is one of the founders of Chiron and a founder of ESHHS, I think was his student for a bit.
Would not surprise me.
He has some of his papers, because I've heard him give a talk about Julian Jaynes was a conscientious objector.
That would be.
So there's a little extra.
Julian Jaynes was the supervisor, my PhD supervisor. Not that I'm claiming any intellectual lineage there. Okay, I'll stop. Thanks, guys.
Okay, thank you.